It was surreal to think that on this disc was something not created by Sega or Sony or Microsoft. That I would place this disc inside a machine that would take me to a world that Nintendo created. The age of cartridges on home consoles was over. Nintendo spent the GameCube era figuring out where it wanted to go for the future, and we got some great games along the way. To enjoy those classics today, we do have newer options, but there are also good reasons to stick with the original hardware. Maybe you already know about the cost associated with GameCube video quality. Well, we've finally got some options now. Welcome to RGB207.
Nintendo entered the sixth console generation in 2001. Featuring a compact and highly portable design, the GameCube is generally considered to sit between the PS2 and Xbox in terms of graphical potential. These systems shed the low-res pixelated look of previous generations, but generally weren't ready to go full-on HD. The GameCube is Nintendo's first console to target 480i as a standard output resolution. Typically, consoles from earlier generations displayed their games in a low-resolution progressive mode called 240p. While 480i displays more detail than 240p, you might notice a bit of a flicker effect when viewing the games on a CRT television. HD TVs, on the other hand, automatically eliminate the flicker with a process called deinterlacing. Depending on your display, you may notice extra lag or visual artifacts due to this process. In NTSC regions, a large number of GameCube titles, including most of the heavy hitters, also support a progressive scan mode, 480p. This display mode is sometimes referred to as enhanced definition, but the GameCube cannot use any HD resolutions. But wait a second, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. You'll notice that all GameCubes have that familiar Nintendo AV out port that we've come to appreciate. In NTSC regions, it only provides composite video and S-video, along with stereo sound, just like the N64. In PAL regions, RGB is natively supported, but unfortunately, no PAL region games include 480p as an option. Instead, PAL users have an option to choose between 50Hz and a smoother NTSC-like 60Hz mode in certain games on compatible screens. Hey, what the heck is this? A new port? Digital AV out. Really? Come on, digital? Actually, yes. Nintendo had ambitions to bring stereoscopic 3D to the GameCube, so this port's inclusion was likely to handle 3D-capable games and accessories that never materialized. But the digital AV out theoretically provides everything you need for digital audio and video. If only there was a way to use it. If you're watching this video, then you probably know where I'm going with this. These cables need no introduction. You want them, but you hate them. Me too. Nintendo sold GameCube component cables in NTSC regions exclusively through their online store. These cables only handle video, so regular AV cables are also required for audio. Component cables provide much better quality than composite, but the benefit over S-video may not be obvious at a glance. Connecting to the digital AV out is the only way to get 480p with compatible games. Now, I know what you're thinking.
That's not digital.
Component cables are analog. Sounds like Coury's a little digitally distracted.
And yeah, you're right. Component cables aren't digital, but the port is digital. And that's why GameCube video quality is a big, crazy, expensive mess. While the newest consoles on the market have abandoned analog altogether, older consoles converted the digital signals internally into something that an analog TV can use. That's exactly what's going on with the GameCube's regular AV port. On the other hand, the digital AV port is theoretically the first ever access to a console's lossless digital signals. except that it requires specially made external hardware to access it. The signal is a digital form of video called YCBCR. This signal isn't very useful in its raw form, so the GameCube component cable contains a digital to analog converter, or DAC, inside the connector itself. This converts the digital video signals into analog form, which is technically referred to as YPBPR, and offers similar results to RGB, but is transmitted in a different color space. There's actually many types of component video, but this is typically what's meant by the generic term component video. Since most TVs at the time didn't support component input, or only offered 480i support from component video, the component cables were not yet in high demand during the GameCube's day. The digital port was removed from new GameCubes in mid-2004, and since Nintendo didn't sell a ton of cables, what's out there is expensive.
Got some rare things on sale, stranger.
Nowadays, they're well over $200.
Not enough cash, stranger.
Composite, S-Video, 480p component. Okay, now let's call these something else. Free, $10 to $30, and $200 to $300. Is each jump in quality worth the extra cost? I don't know, that's a tough call to make.
Come back anytime.
If you have no qualms against hacking into such a rarity, it's possible to modify component cables for VGA. Nintendo also made a D-terminal version for the Japanese market, so if you have the right connector or adapter for it, this might be an option worth looking into. We've heard stories of people lucking into some for only about $100. To bring up the progressive scan prompt, hold B while booting a supported game. Sometimes it's automatic, but you should always hold B just to be sure. Progressive scan is not natively supported on any PAL region games for the system. 480p is a far cry from what you might be used to seeing from modern games. Yeah, component cables will improve your image, but we recommend keeping your expectations in check. Since your HDTV or Framemeister is already capable of deinterlacing 480i, the benefits of 480p may not be apparent to you without a direct comparison. Some people might even prefer the softer look of S-Video. 480p can, however, reduce input lag since deinterlacing is not necessary. It certainly looks good, but component cables aren't like some magic trick to turn your GameCube games into HD remakes or something. Oh, by the way, while you may have noticed that we love to show off the Framemeister's razor-sharp pixels for 240p games, we use smoother pixel settings for 480i and 480p. We feel that the GameCube's not quite retro but not quite HD look works best this way. A lot of people even prefer to bypass the Framemeister for 480p and just let their HDTV do its own thing. And 480p really does shine on professional video monitors. If your PVM supports 31 kHz, it's arguably the most impressive resolution for these screens. In the early 2000s, there were also a lot of EDTVs, or enhanced definition televisions. Typically, these were LCD screens with a native resolution of 640 by 480. These are also a good fit for 480p, but modern LCDs have a much better black level and less ghosting. Because the GameCube doesn't encode analog component video internally, it's pretty much impossible to make a simple cable for it. The connector was unique, and the DAC chip is of an application-specific design, which means that to engineer a replacement for it would be challenging to say the least. That's why we've gone for so long without a viable alternative to the official Nintendo cables. But it seems as though the situation has finally changed.
For all their stubbornness, Nintendo was actually ready for digital video a generation before Sony or Microsoft, even if they wouldn't embrace it for another decade. If the GameCube had been on the market for another 5 years, Nintendo might have even made an HDMI cable for it. And that's where the GC Video project comes in, to bring the GameCube's digital capabilities to its ultimate potential that Nintendo stopped short of. In 2014, an engineer going by the name Unseen released his analysis of how the GameCube's digital output works, creating an open source project called GC Video. What this means is that GC Video is not a proprietary creation like the HDMI and RGB mods for NES or N64. anyone can create and sell their own custom solution based on Unseen's information and firmware. GC Video comes in two flavors, digital and analog. The digital version can result in something like a standard HDMI port, for example. The analog version is called GC Video Lite and opens up options for converting the digital signal to component or RGB. The reason we're seeing mods like this appear now and not much sooner is thanks to the decreasing cost of FPGAs, Field Programmable Gate Arrays. These are small integrated circuits that can be programmed to be a new hardware design or to mimic other hardware configurations. They're commonly available in the form of a development kit. Though many standard models exist, software can be used to design custom boards for specialty use or even for limited mass production. Since anyone can make their own version of the GC Video mod, we've seen options using standard FPGA dev kits as well as custom designs. But the video quality and functionality for any GC Video mod should be identical since, well, digital has lossless quality and they all use Unseen's firmware. Currently, all solutions are internal. Typical methods involve removing the digital out port in some fashion, but not necessarily. Non-invasive external options, both for digital and analog, are expected to become available in the near future. GC Video is theoretically possible on consoles that lack the digital port, but more mod work is required. Matt Buxton has been one of our biggest allies and sources of information since we started the RGB Masterclass series. And in November 2015, his UK-based website Video Game Perfection became the first to offer GameCube HDMI mods as a widely available service. Tony Moore of Insomniac Games and Club Pixel Perfect let us intercept his HDMI modded GameCube on its way back from the UK. And before we sent it off to him, we had the opportunity to put digital GC Video through its paces. This early implementation uses a standard Pluto 2X FPGA HDMI development board with the GC Video firmware. Supported resolutions are identical to the capabilities of the original digital port, 240p, 480i, 480p, and the equivalent PAL resolutions. Yes, really, 240p over HDMI, and my Samsung HD TV even recognizes it correctly. You might be disappointed that GC Video does not handle upscaling to 720p or 1080p, but we feel that this isn't a huge problem. HD TVs tend to treat 480i and 480p much better than 240p, and you can of course let an external device like the Framemeister handle scaling and deinterlacing if you prefer. Just like with component cables, native 480p output has to be manually activated when booting compatible games. Holding R, L, X, and Y brings up the GC Video on-screen interface. Settings are much simpler than what you may have seen in our episodes featuring the NES and N64 HDMI mods. The line doubler optionally forces a normally interlaced 480i game to display in deinterlaced 480p. It works pretty well, though the result is perhaps a bit over sharp, revealing jaggies. You might choose to turn off line doubling and let your TV or external scaler handle deinterlacing for a smoother look. But the line doubler's 480p output should in theory result in less lag. As for the system's limited 240p games, the Framemeister seems to hate receiving 240p over HDMI. Matt tells us he was able to get digital 240p to work with the Framemeister, so your mileage may vary. Either way, the line doubler got me around this issue. Scan lines in 480p looks a bit inauthentic to me, covering up half the resolution. It's just not something that defined the look of games in the GameCube's generation. Scan lines do work well for the system's very few 240p games, which otherwise look a bit blobby over HDMI. Each resolution saves separate preferences. None of the settings add any input lag. Compared to component, HDMI is a very similar result. It is of course a lossless digital image, but the official component cables do perform an extremely high quality analog conversion. It's not so much an upgrade as it is an alternative that uses a more accessible connector. So what's the cost? Well, that's tough to nail down. As an open source project, the GC Video mod may vary wildly in price, depending on what type of board is used, what type of finish the installation has, whether you're more of a do-it-yourself sort or if you need the services of a modder like we do. Not to mention, each modder's individual method of delivering GC video could change as the project evolves. Video Game Perfection, for example, has developed a custom circuit and new implementation that keeps the digital output working and intact. Check their mods page for pricing and availability. Michael, the man behind the US-based Badass Consoles, has just wrapped up his own preparations for GC Video, and we're very excited to have the opportunity to debut some of his very creative ideas. Michael has designed his own circuit boards, one version for digital and another for analog, made specifically to fit cleanly inside the limited space. Both still require the removal of the digital port, but he's designed 3D printed parts that will go into production using molded ABS injection to provide a factory finish look. He's offering boards and plastic parts separately for do-it-yourselfers or his own installation services. Digital and analog versions cost the same. Michael's analog solution is pretty clever. Just use common and inexpensive Wii component cables, or PAL RGB cables for the Wii. He tells us that his tests even showed GC Video Lite as being several hundred nanoseconds faster than Nintendo's analog video encoder. And get this, the unused audio cables can actually carry horizontal and vertical sync for a VGA signal. Badass Consoles plans for the money from the internal project to fund a plug-and-play version. No modifications needed. Michael's designed a replacement for the digital port plug that can then spit out the signal as HDMI, or the analog version, which will, again, connect to Wii component cables. Due to the cost of parts, these non-invasive options will be a bit more expensive than the internal mods, but vastly more affordable than the official component cables. We hope to feature the plug-and-play options in a future episode. Now, a lot of you have probably been wondering, why should I go through all this trouble when I can just play GameCube games in 480p on the Wii? Well, it is worth consideration. Let's take a look.
While the Wii is known for its radically different style of control, on the inside it's simply an evolved GameCube with a bit more power. Now, this isn't the place to debate whether Nintendo made the right choice, but this had the benefit of giving the Wii perhaps the most pitch-perfect backwards compatibility that any console has ever had. Simply put, GameCube games run exactly like they do on original hardware. I mean, exactly. We're unaware of any examples of GameCube titles that have even the slightest quirk or hiccup when played on the Wii. If the best video cables you have for your GameCube are composite or S-Video, then component on the Wii is an excellent alternative. I mean, heck, that's what I use. Keep in mind that the Wii system settings pertain only to Wii software, so you'll still need to choose progressive scan when booting GameCube games. So wait a second. How come we've been going on and on about rare accessories or complicated mods for this entire episode? It's so easy to get good quality video using the Wii's backwards compatibility and some component cables. Well, it's been thoroughly established by the GameCube community that the Wii's video output is not as high quality as what the Cube's component cables can produce. The Wii provides all of its video options through a single analog port, with no access to a digital signal. So let's take a look. Here's a day one Wii versus a day one GameCube, both with official component cables. Can you guess which is which? We've got to be honest, it's really hard for us to tell one from the other. So even though it might be true that a technical analysis of signal quality reveals issues with the Wii's output, we feel that in practice, most people will be equally happy with the component video quality from either system. Years later, Nintendo removed GameCube backwards compatibility with the RVL101 model revision, but we've heard that these consoles have superior video quality. Luckily, they can be forced to play GameCube games with homebrew hacks. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get our hands on one to test, but we've been assured that it's not any better than component video on an actual GameCube. The Wii Mini not only lacks backwards compatibility, but also supports composite video only. Ugh. The Wii U is equipped for backwards compatibility through virtualization, but only with Wii games. But a couple of homebrew methods called Nintendo and Devolution are actually able to restore GameCube support in the system's Wii mode. We collaborated with the YouTube channel Pause Break Reviews to get recordings of Nintendo in action. For the most part, GameCube games run exactly as you'd hope, which just goes to show how much the GameCube and Wii really have in common. This, of course, allows for digital HDMI output, but remember, internal resolution is still 480p. Note that the Wii U disk drive does not support GameCube-style mini discs, and the games can only run as rips on an SD card or external hard drive. So if all you want to do is play GameCube games in good quality 480p, a regular backwards compatible Wii with component cables is a perfectly fine option. But let's get to the point. Why do we really want high quality out of the GameCube? It's not for GameCube games, it's for Game Boy games. Hey, now that is a cube. Nintendo released the Game Boy player in 2003 for only $50. Sure, we could already play regular Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo with the Super Game Boy, but the Game Boy player offered the first commercially available option for playing Game Boy Color exclusives and Game Boy Advance games on your TV. What's exciting about the Game Boy player is that it's authentic Game Boy Advance hardware, not emulation. What's less exciting is the software that controls it. The Game Boy player requires a boot disc to actually play Game Boy games. Similar to the Super Game Boy, borders surround these lower resolution games. There is a zoom function that helps fill the screen, but it's pretty blurry. This is especially noticeable on modern displays. Unfortunately, the Game Boy player software only supports 480i and 480p, when 240p really would have been a more appropriate resolution for GBA games. Thankfully, the Game Boy player is more than the software that drives it, and Homebrew lets us tap into its full potential. You can install a mod chip in your GameCube to use Homebrew software, or you could simply buy an SD Media Launcher, which lets you boot Homebrew from memory card slot B while using an included Action Replay disc. We bought ours from Code Junkies, and it's a lot less expensive than you might expect. One of the cornerstones of the GameCube Homebrew scene is Swiss. It's a multi-use utility, but the main function we want to look at here is forcing resolutions. After swapping the Game Boy player disc, choose 240p from the options, and voila! Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games in 240p. To ensure that the pixels line up correctly, you'll have to use borders, but we've had good success with filling the screen with the Framemeister's zoom function. But even still, the Game Boy player software is not perfect. It has well-documented issues with frame stuttering and input lag. Thankfully, one of the engineers behind Swiss has developed the Game Boy interface, a brilliant piece of software that not only eliminates the need for the Game Boy player boot disc, but is actually capable of running games at a more accurate refresh with much less input lag. RGB from a PAL GameCube might be a good option for Game Boy games in 240p, but since only sync on composite is supported, the signal may appear noisy unless your cables are built with superior shielding. Playing Game Boy games on the big screen is such a hugely involved topic that we simply can't look at every angle in this episode. Keep an eye out for a dedicated Game Boy episode in the future.
So 240p is really amazing for Game Boy games, but there are a few more interesting things that we can do with Swiss to tweak image quality. The most exciting thing is that you can force 480p in games that don't natively support it. This has no impact on performance. Why devs didn't universally include 480p as an option, nobody knows. Needless to say, this is especially exciting for GameCube fans in PAL regions, where no games were released with 480p functionality. It is possible that some games may crash or not work correctly when forcing 480p, but for the most part, it just works. You can also force widescreen, which is interesting, but I don't really recommend it. Polygonal graphics render nicely, but 2D elements end up stretched. Objects and characters may also pop in and out at the edges of the screen, where they were expected to be unseen on a 4x3 display. While 240p output might not be ideal for GameCubes modded for HDMI, the GC Video Scanline feature does give a nice effect on Game Boy games, even in 480p mode. But if you're interested in forcing 240p for a CRT or external upscaler, then you should probably be looking at analog options rather than HDMI. And lastly, we'd never hear the end of it if we didn't mention the Dolphin emulator. The Dolphin is perhaps the most famous emulator of recent generations, with high-res screenshots of popular GameCube and Wii games making frequent headlines. But in practice, you can expect to run into hiccups, various visual glitches, and more major issues that can detract from the experience. It seems neat to tinker with, but for now, we don't think it's quite ready for just sitting down and really playing a game. And for us, it will never beat the feeling of playing on real hardware or proper HD conversions. But we absolutely think it's an impressive feat of programming and a fascinating look at just how gorgeously crafted some of Nintendo's pre-HD titles really are. If there's one word that can sum up the GameCube hardware, it's potential. Not knowing what would come in the early 21st century, Nintendo equipped the GameCube for a multitude of possibilities, but kept the keys to its potential close to the chest. But now, if you aren't lucky enough to own GameCube component cables, and you still want to play on a real GameCube, you finally have options. And I have a feeling that we haven't yet seen the last of its potential.